Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Economic World. I'm your host, here to peel back the layers of the financial onion until we're all crying, hopefully from laughter, but maybe from the sheer absurdity of what just happened. Today is December 11th, 2025. If you're watching this, congratulations, you survived another Federal Reserve meeting. But folks, let me tell you, what happened yesterday in the Eccles building wasn't a meeting. It was a bar fight in expensive suits. On the surface, everything looks fine. The S&P 500 is popping champagne, up 0.7%, flirting with all-time highs again. The 10-year Treasury yield chilled out, dropping to 4.15%. Jerome Powell walked out to the podium, flashed that grandfatherly smile, and told us everything is normalizing. But here is the truth they won't tell you on the mainstream cable news: the Federal Reserve is broken. The consensus is dead. And we are currently flying this economic plane with one engine on fire and the navigation system turned off. Yesterday, the Fed cut interest rates for the third consecutive time, dropping the benchmark by a quarter point to a range of 3.5% to 3.75%. Sounds standard, right? Wrong. Look at the vote count, 9-3. We haven't seen 3 dissents in a single meeting since 2019. This is the monetary policy equivalent of a family holiday dinner where Uncle Austin is screaming about inflation, Cousin Stephen is screaming about a recession, and Grandpa Jay is just trying to carve the turkey without stabbing anyone. Today, we are going to dissect this 9-3 split, explain why the Fed has suddenly turned back on the money printer in the shadows, and analyze the terrifying reality of stagflation light that is brewing under our noses. Let's dig deep. Let's start with what they said. The FOMC statement was a masterclass in bureaucratic gymnastics. They cut rates, yes. But they also subtly changed the language. Back in October, they talked about considering additional adjustments. Yesterday? They reverted to the ominous phrasing from last December, considering the extent and timing of additional adjustments. Words matter, my friends. In Fed speak, adding extent and timing is the equivalent of a driver tapping the brakes because he sees fog ahead. It means, we don't know if we are cutting again in January. In fact, we might just sit on our hands. Jerome Powell took the stage and gave us the Goldilocks narrative. He said, and I quote, "This further normalization of our policy stance should help stabilize the labor market while allowing inflation to resume its downward trend toward 2% once the effects of tariffs have passed through." Did you catch that? Once the effects of tariffs have passed through. Powell is essentially admitting that the trade war 2.0 we are living through is spiking prices, but he's praying to the economic gods that it's temporary. He's betting his legacy that this is a one-time price shock, not a permanent inflation spiral. When a reporter asked him if the next cut was a done deal, Powell pulled a classic maneuver. He demurred. He said a rate hike isn't the base case, but he refused to commit to a cut. Why? Because he can't. He has lost control of the room. Let's look at the dissenters, because this is where the real story lies. This 9-3 vote tells us that the Fed is no longer looking at the same data. They are looking at two different realities. The Hawks, Goolsbee and Schmidt first. We have Austin Goolsbee from Chicago and Jeff Schmidt from Kansas City. These two voted against the cut. They wanted to hold rates steady. Why? Because they are looking at the inflation scoreboard. The Fed's preferred gauge of inflation rose 2.8% in the year through September. Folks, the target is 2%. We are nearly 50% above the target. Goolsbee and Schmidt are haunted by the ghosts of the 1970s. They know that if you cut rates while inflation is sticking near 3%, you risk pouring gasoline on a fire that is already smoldering. They look at the recent tariff announcements and see a wage price spiral coming. To them, cutting rates right now is madness. The dove, Stephen Miron. Then, on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we have Governor Stephen Miron. Remember him? He was appointed by President Trump back in September. Miron voted against the cut too, but not because he wanted to hold. He wanted a 50 basis point cut. He wanted the jumbo cut. Why? Because Miron is looking at the labor market. Unemployment hit 4.4% in September, up from 4.1% in June. If you follow the SOM rule, a recession indicator based on unemployment trends, lights are flashing red in the dashboard. Miron believes the economy is cratering faster than the data shows, and he wants to flood the system with cheap money now. So, who is right? The terrified hawks seeing inflation? Or the terrified dove seeing a recession? Here is the ugly truth: they are both right. We are entering a period of stagflation light. Growth is slowing, but prices are rising. The Fed's traditional toolbox is useless here. If they cut rates to help jobs, inflation explodes. If they hike rates to stop inflation, the job market crashes. Powell is trying to walk the middle path, a tiny 25 basis point cut, hoping it's enough to save jobs but small enough not to spike inflation. But a 9-3 vote tells you that nobody believes this compromise will work. Now, let's add a layer of chaos that nobody is talking about enough: the government shutdown. We've had a partial government shutdown for weeks. What does that mean for an economist? It means the data faucet has been turned off. We are missing key reports. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is operating on a skeleton crew. The Fed just made a monumental policy decision based on data from September and October because the November/December picture is blurry. Imagine driving a Ferrari at 150 miles per hour on an icy road. Now imagine the government puts a blindfold on you. That is Jerome Powell right now. The conflicting data mentioned in the FOMC minutes, unemployment up to 4.4%, inflation stuck at 2.8%, is already old news. The reality on the ground today, December 11th, could be much worse, but the shutdown is hiding the bodies. Now, I want to talk about something that was buried in the footnotes of yesterday's announcement. Most people missed it because they were too busy looking at the dot plot. Fed officials also authorized fresh purchases of short-term Treasury securities to maintain an ample supply of bank reserves. Let me translate that for you. This is stealth QE. Since 2022, the Fed has been doing quantitative tightening, selling off bonds to shrink their balance sheet and suck money out of the system. They told us this was necessary to fight inflation. But yesterday, starting today, December 12th, they are buying Treasury securities again. They claim it's just to support liquidity in overnight funding markets and avoid a repeat of the 2019 repo crisis. Don't be fooled by the technical jargon. The Fed is cutting rates and injecting liquidity into the market at the same time. Why would they do that if the economy is strong? Why do that if stocks are at all-time highs? Because the banking system is thirstier than a traveler in the desert. The reserves are getting tight. Wall Street banks have been quietly screaming that they don't have enough cash to grease the wheels of the repo market. So, Powell is quietly turning the money spigot back on, all while pretending to be tough on inflation. It's a magic trick. Look at my left hand, don't look at my right hand. We cannot analyze this meeting without talking about the political sledgehammer hanging over the Fed. President Trump has made it very clear, he wants lower rates. He has criticized the Fed for being too slow. His appointment of Stephen Miron was a shot across the bow. Now, Trump says he has already decided who will replace Powell next May. He's going to announce it early next year. Powell is a lame duck chairman. He has 5 months left. This creates a dangerous dynamic. The White House is pushing for growth and cheap money. The Fed is trying to maintain its independence. And then there are the tariffs. Powell said, let's assume there are no major new tariff announcements, inflation from goods should peak in the first quarter. That is a massive assumption. That is like saying, let's assume it doesn't rain, while standing in the middle of a monsoon. The administration's trade policy is built on tariffs. If we get a 10% universal baseline tariff or higher specific tariffs on tech imports, that 2.8% inflation isn't going to 2%. It's going to 4%. If that happens, the Fed's plan to cut rates in 2026 evaporates. Let's look at the dot plot, the forecast of where rates are going. The median projection is now, 1 cut in 2026. 1 cut in 2027. Wait a minute. Investors were pricing in 3 cuts next year. Now the Fed says 1. And look at the split within the Fed, 7 officials want to hold rates steady for all of 2026. 8 officials want at least 2 cuts. The committee is split almost 50-50ths. They have absolutely no idea what the next 12 months look like. They upgraded the growth forecast for 2026 to 2.3%. They downgraded the inflation forecast to 2.4%. This is the immaculate disinflation fantasy. They believe the economy will grow faster, but inflation will fall lower, all while they barely cut rates. In the real world, this rarely happens. Usually, if growth accelerates, inflation sticks or rises. If inflation falls, it's usually because growth crushed. The Fed is forecasting a miracle. And as an economist, I don't bet on miracles, I bet on incentives and data. So, let's wrap this up and restore the full picture. What is the truth behind the event? 1. The pivot is grinding to a halt. The easy cuts are over. The Fed has moved from automatic cuts to wait and pray. The change in language confirms this. 2. The Fed is fractured. The 9-3 vote proves the consensus is broken. The internal fight between fighting inflation and saving jobs is spilling into the open. This creates volatility. 3. Liquidity is back. The fresh purchases of treasuries mean the Fed is propping up the banking plumbing. This is bullish for assets in the short term because money is entering the system, even if the economy is shaky. 4. The consumer is the casualty. With inflation at 2.8% and unemployment rising to 4.4%, the average American is getting squeezed from both sides. Rates are still restrictive, so credit card debt and mortgages remain expensive. My advice to you? Don't get drunk on the stock market rally. The S&P 500 rising today is a liquidity rally, driven by the Fed buying bonds, not by economic fundamentals. Watch the 10-year yield. If it starts creeping back up toward 4.5% because of inflation fears, the party is over. And keep an eye on the labor market. If unemployment breaks 4.5%, the Fed will panic and push for bigger cuts, inflation be damned. The Fed is trying to land a jumbo jet on an aircraft carrier in rough seas. Powell says he's got this. The 9-3 vote says the crew is fighting over the controls. Buckle up. 2026 is going to be a bumpy ride. This is the boss, signing off. Stay sharp, watch the liquidity, and I'll see you in the next episode.